Good morning and good evening to our participants. Welcome to the panel on feminist perspectives on Russia's war against Ukraine. My name is Ksenya Kiebuzinski. I am the co-director of the Petro Jacyk program for the study of Ukraine at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. This panel we organized originally in mid-February with the hopes of holding it in the first week of March, not knowing whether Russia would really invade and start its war against Ukraine. And we delayed this session as kind of economic interests and sanctions were being put in place. We were having panels and events being held on military and strategic issues, but gender and sexuality issues are just as important. We are pleased to have 4 panelists here to help us discuss these issues. I think against the background of thinking about women participating in the armed forces, but so unity of gender, but also division of gender with men not being able to leave Ukraine between the ages of 18 and 60, women making up a large percentage of those who are displaced and currently refugees in Europe and elsewhere. Also, in terms of women being used as objects of and victims in terms of rapes, such as the atrocities that occurred at Bucha. And I think that often an overlooked issue, and I hope our panelists will discuss it, is about the elderly women bearing witness to perhaps a second round of atrocities. They're survivors of the Second World War, and now again, this ongoing war of Russia against Ukraine. Also sexuality issues. What does it mean for the outcome of the war? What does the future hold for civil society in Ukraine? And also, what does it mean to be a refugee in conservative countries such as Poland that are largely Catholic? So to help us navigate all this, we have 4 speakers. First will be Tamara Martsenyuk, who is an associate professor at the Department of Sociology, University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, where she has taught courses on gender studies, gender and politics, masculinity and men's studies, and social problems in Ukraine and in the world. Second, we will have Anna Dovgopol, who is a coordinator of the Gender Democracy Program at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, Kyiv office, Ukraine. She is a gender expert and a trainer and a feminist with over 10 years of experience with LGBT and feminist activism in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan, including 3 years as a member of Kyiv Pride Organizing Committee. Third, Tamara Zlobina, who holds a PhD in philosophy. She is an editor-in-chief of online magazine Gender in Details. And finally, we have Marusya Bociurkiw, who is a professor of media theory at Ryerson University here in Toronto, where she teaches courses in media studies, social justice, media and documentary production, and conducts research on areas of feminist and queer archives, media activism, and migration studies. She is also an author, storyteller, theorist, and an award-winning filmmaker. Her recent film, which I know has been shown here in Toronto at the university a couple of times, the award-winning documentary, This is Gay Propaganda, LGBT Rights and the War in Ukraine. So to begin, I turn over the floor to Tamara Martsenyuk.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Hello to everyone. Thanks a lot again for organizing this event and inviting us to participate. I now I'm refugee scholar. After staying 9 days in Kyiv, I evacuated, and after 3 days, I ended up in Berlin. And currently, I'm a temporary guest researcher at Free University of Berlin. And being sociologist and doing research on women in Euromaidan protests and war in Donbass, I want to reflect a bit on this and also to explain the current situation as a legacy of women's participation in Euromaidan protests and war in Donbass. Ukrainian women managed to challenge traditional gender roles as caretakers and victims of conflict, and reclaimed visibility, recognition, and respect as revolutionaries and volunteers. And as a result of this revolution and of dignity, I do believe that women gained more rights, especially when we talk about women labor rights in the military. And I was involved in sociological research called Invisible Battalion, where we studied women's involvement in the military sphere. And when war started in 2014, women joined the front lines as volunteers, journalists, medical staff, and military on combat positions. And our three large sociological studies called Invisible Battalion, and through the title you could guess that it's made through more liberal feminist perspective. It demonstrates successes and challenges of gender equality implementation in the Ukrainian armed forces. Also, we study the status of female veterans, and women's veterans movement in Ukraine is quite visible. And also the problem of sexual harassment in military. Currently, the war interrupted our studies on women's access to military education. And as far as for last 8 years, women were actively involved and visible in military sphere, also in volunteer activism in NGOs. We could see that now women are agents or actors of resistance. Sociologically, I could divide women's involvement into two spheres, and I'll start with agency, and I do believe that compared to Euromaidan protests now in this in this recent Russian mass invasion in Ukraine, because actually the war started in 2014 as from annexation of Crimea and annexation of part of Donbass, women even in this visual pictures and self-made posters, you could see there is quite a lot of agency and resistance, and women are actively participate in the armed forces. There are approximately actually more than 10% of women in armed forces in territorial self-defense. We can't say exactly the numbers, but it's also around I would say around 5% women of different age, not only younger women, as you could see from this picture of military women. They address Russian soldiers who came on Ukrainian land, and they address in their videos that you come here and you will die. But also all the women, they participate, and women are very active volunteers. And this picture where a woman was evacuating dogs with disability from Irpin. This picture also became an icon of Ukrainian resistance, and women they are not only fight with arms, but they participate in a number of activities. But actually, all Ukrainian representative study they that was conducted in around 1 month ago in the beginning of March represent the data that 67% of Ukrainians are ready to personally participate in the armed resistance to end the Russian occupation of Ukraine. Among them, women constitute around 60%. And women, they, very stereotypically, when I participate in other events and people expect that I will be talking about, first of all, about peace, because very stereotypically women are associated with peacemaking, peace building. But at the same time, I would say I wanted to show 2 examples where women ask for weapon in this situation. Of course, they would like to have peace, but Maria Berlinska, initiator of Invisible Battalion Advocacy Project, veteran and volunteer women's rights advocate, she's currently coming, to US and talk to politicians and asks for weapon and she explains very clearly also in her Facebook the reason why it is so. Another example, Alexandra Matvichuk, I participated with her in one event, and she's human rights defender and coordinates the documentation of war crimes tribunal for Putin coalition. And she says that usually, of course, she uses, legislative tools. But now again, in her public speeches, she's writing about the fact that Ukraine needs a weapon in order to protect peaceful citizens and heavy weaponry. And it's really, so it's not very often where such human rights defenders, they are forced to write about diversity of different weapons for the sake of, to save the situation. At the same time, women who are majority among those who are refugees, they organize and participate in protests abroad. And here's a picture from protest where I also participated in April 7th in Berlin near Bundestag, where we were addressing German politicians and asked embargo to Russian gas and oil, and women are very actively organizing all these events around all over the world. On the other hand, women are victims and vulnerable groups, and very often, of course, you see in videos, first of all, women, those who are responsible for kids and elderly, those who, some of them first time in their life, they travel abroad, and those who are being raped and they are victims or potential victims of sex trafficking. And there are a number of examples. I just pay attention to only one, Ukrainian Madonna. You see how also different artists, they work with these female images. And in this particular case, mother from Kiev protected her baby. She was heavily wounded, but her baby survived. And there are a number of such examples of both, it's resistance, protection, and also care. Women are in top politics, solving issues. For example, Irina Vereshchuk, who is Minister for Reintegration of the Temporary Occupied Territories, and she's very active as President Zelensky with public speeches. And here she in her Facebook, she puts photo of Ukrainian soldiers liberated from Russian captivity. Among them, there are also women. And you see that women, their heads were shaved. And a historian and scholar, researcher of sexual violence, Marta Gavryshko, she writes that it's a cruel attack on women's bodily integrity and intimacy because of the cultural meaning of hair for women. Hair is a strong conjunction with femininity, women's self-perception and dignity, but at the same time, you see that even despite of tortures and sexual violence, these women, they still have a dignity, and of course, they don't want to be perceived, first of all, as victims. And I want to finish with this slide that demonstrates that actually some myths are already actively used in this war, and witches, witchcraft, and valkyrias are popular Ukrainian images for women. Kyiv was famous and is for witches, and actually sometimes military women, they call themselves valkyrias. And in this self-made poster, you could see that in the situation where we Ukrainians ask to shelter the sky, and it doesn't happen. Girls, let's close the sky. Ukrainian women, witches, they are supposed to do this. And this metaphor is also used sometimes by Ukrainian military and in different dressing. And it's probably one of the also interesting images to analyze. I will stop here. Thanks a lot for your attention, and later would be glad to answer your question.
Thank you, Tamara. And before I turn it over to Anna, I just wanted to point out to our audience that there is a link in the chat for where you can donate funds depending on your conscience, whether it's military, medical, humanitarian aid. Anna, after Tamara spoke, I was wondering what is the level of acceptance or resistance to this integration of women into the military, and what does the future hold?
Thank you, Ksenia, and thank you, Tamara. You have made a great overview, basically raised most of the points that I totally agree with. And answering your question, Ksenia, and just following up, and I would like to highlight some of the points which I think are important to note in terms of gender and the war, and this particular war. Sorry, it's difficult to say exactly what is the acceptance of women in military, since there is obviously no research data. But from how I can perceive, and my colleagues can comment on that as well, people in Ukraine are just accepting things as they are. We all work for our common victory. And this is the exciting part, and it also demonstrates that we have done a lot of work before. When our president speaks, he uses, in Ukrainian language, you have feminine and masculine forms to address men and women. And we had this discussion for a long time to use so-called feminitives, to use feminine forms for professions of women. So there was a lot of reluctance to this, but then more and more media and public people started using this. So now when president addresses Ukrainian nation every day, and when other politicians speak about Ukrainians, they always say, захисники та захисниці. So they all use feminine forms, which is a huge recognition on the level of the politicians, on the level of the president, that there are women in the army. And those who comment on this, people who know the situation from inside, they say that once you're in the army, nobody cares. You just have to do your work as good as you do. And a lot of women fight, and a lot of women have been detained as prisoners by the Russian army. And what is also important, that it's not only about being heroines in the war field, but women often are leaders of local councils, mayors of small towns. And the mayor of Bucha town, the town that where this huge massacre took place, was woman, and she didn't leave the town even though she could, and she was basically slaughtered, and all her family was slaughtered. So, and this is just one of the examples. So a lot of women do stay and take care of, well, not only of their houses, but of their communities. What is also important to note, I would say, the discourse on gender roles that we witness wider in the society, that you know, as you said, Ksenia, that men are not allowed to leave the country, the men before until 60. And there is quite a degrade, I would say, in the public discourse to those men who left eastern regions, or who left the war zone, and they are internally displaced people, or who were abroad and didn't come back, even though a lot of men did. So, and this is, there is still this discussion that all men have to fight, even though officially there is, as I've seen recently, it's only 1% of men who actually fight in the army. So it's not that everyone can fight, even if they want. And there are, at the beginning of the war, there were huge lines of volunteers who basically, of volunteered men, less women, but still, who wanted to protect. They were members of this territorial defense unit, which were not the proper army, but this people who took care of the city, and not everybody could even get in because there were more people than places. But still, this discourse is there, and but what is also important, that there is a discussion and a lot of I would say progressive civil society people come and say we all do what we can, and you don't have to fight if you're a man, and you don't have to live necessarily if you're a woman. And I think this is a very good tendency, that there is this discussion, and this discussion is not inspired by a small group of feminists, but it's just it goes wider. And I think this is quite an achievement of the feminist movement, of the so-called homework that we have done before. And just the last point that I would say, as you said, that I was also working with LGBT community, and just one point, that LGBT community equally participates. Some of them volunteer, some of them have left. Obviously, there is much more for activists and for LGBT people to be afraid in the regions if they are occupied by Russians, because they follow, these people would be more in the focus of the Russian aggressors, and they would be, there is much more risk that they will be detained, tortured, and killed. And they specifically follow the conduct of activists, but still there are quite a lot of LGBT people who fight in the army. So there is no any divide line in this regard. And I will stop here.
Thank you. Before we proceed to Tamara, I just want to invite participants to put questions in the Q&A, and we may be able to take 1 or 2 questions live as well. Tamara, what would you like to add to the previous presentations? And I know you kind of think more philosophically about these issues and notions of gender eclecticism, which perhaps you might want to explain to our audience what that means. So please, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello to everyone. Thank you for your question. I will gladly comment on all of this, and thank you, Tamara and Anna, for this brief overview of what is going on now in Ukraine. The main focus of my speech today is on feminist stereotypes that does not work in Ukraine, and it's really very curious, and I think that the rest of the world can learn a lot from Ukrainian example. As Tamara Martsenyuk already told us, on Euromaidan, we had certain achievements of women volunteers and women participation in the building of civil society. But Tamara also has a brilliant article on gender stereotypes on Euromaidan and how these stereotypes were represented. And we must admit that if one analyzes media coverage of Euromaidan events, at that time the media coverage was stereotypical and sexist. Women were represented as caregivers, as those who participate by making food, and men were represented as revolutionaries. So there were even kind of slogans like "men are doing a revolution" and "women are helping them." But it was not a correct description of reality. We had a situation when the common vision of reality, the public stereotypes were traditional, but the reality itself was very emancipated. But public media and public discourse didn't have this emancipated language to describe what was going on. And because of that, there were a lot of fake conclusions and fake predictions from feminists that didn't come true. Because I remember that during and after Euromaidan, we had discussions that after Euromaidan, we would have a right turn in our society, that we wouldn't have any gender equality, that there would be a ban on abortion. But none of that didn't happen. And we had an abundance in emancipation of society, emancipation of men and women in public discussions. There are much more feminists present in public space in Ukraine now. So the results of Euromaidan were the contrary to typical feminist predictions of what should happen. And something like this is going on now, but not with Ukrainian feminists, but rather with international feminists who has their own stereotypes about what war is and how the feminist resistance to war should look like. And I deeply worry about the mistakes that are done by people who think using stereotypes. And I want to share my screen, and I want to show you an example of a feminist thought that is led by complete stereotype. So this is a manifesto. I don't know the initiative group who wrote it, and it's called Feminist Resistance Against War. And I will point on 2 issues in this text. The first issue is that With this manifesto, we collect the call launched by Russian feminist groups and join the feminist resistance against war. As far as I know, none of Ukrainian feminists was asked to consult on this statement. None participated in creating it, and even none was invited to sign it, because I check all the signatures here, and you can see Canada, Spain, Chile, Portugal, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, Denmark, Russia, United States, Canada, but no Ukraine. No single person from Ukraine. And I need to say that I'm outraged, because this is completely colonial attitude towards Ukraine, towards Ukrainian feminists, to make a feminist anti-war resistance statement without even consulting any of Ukrainian feminists and asking on our opinion. And it's also a problem because of that, because we were not consulted. There are quite dangerous stuff in this statement, and this dangerous stuff, I want to highlight it for you. And it's here. We reject the decisions that involve adding more weapons to the conflict and increasing war budgets. That is a typical feminist anti-war position. I understand it, because feminists are the most critic of militarization. And it's a good thing to do, but you can allow yourself to do this only if you are protected. I suppose that if you live in imperialist state, you should be anti-militarist. But if you live in a state that is threatened by a very strong enemy, you cannot critique your country for buying more weapons, because that is actually what we see now, and what Tamara Martsenyuk showed to us, that Ukrainian feminists use any possibility to talk that we need more weapons. And actually, I will use this possibility to talk and to comment on this as well, and I will show you what we actually need, because now we need heavy weaponry, we need airplanes, we need tanks, and we need air defense system to defend Ukraine, to fight the enemy, because enemy is here. And we are not given this weaponry. We still are using some small weaponry that is not enough. And in situation like this, we cannot use these all theoretical structures of feminist anti-imperialist thought, because they were created inside imperialist context. So I want to highlight it, that if you live inside an imperialist country, you need to critique the militarization. But if you live inside the country that is attacked, and if you want to support a country that is attacked right now, like in Ukraine, you need more weapons. You need more weapons to defend yourself, and with this, you cannot make a feminist statement like we reject the decisions that involve adding more weapons, because it looks this statement like this, one behave on her own feminist principles, but the result of this gesture, of this demand, is in contradiction with feminist principles, because I suppose that the core of feminism is to protect those who are weak. And we need to protect them doing some active action that will have a result. And just claiming that we are against war just makes the war stop. Unfortunately, these claims won't stop the war, and only good heavy weapons given to Ukrainian armed forces can stop the war. So I hope that today, with feminists on the international level, we can make this dialogue, and maybe we can look for new feminist decisions to these challenges. Thank you very much for giving me a possibility to say this, and I will be glad to hear the further discussion.
Thank you, Tamara. It's a very curious statement, and I would like to know under whose sponsorship it was written, because it definitely does not seem right. I was disappointed to see a faculty member from the University of Toronto on the list as you were scrolling by. But unfortunately, Marusya Bociurkiw has not joined us. We were hoping that she would be able to still come, and if she does, we'll put her on. The one thing that I did not hear was a discussion about generational differences. So we have talk about the advances in emancipatory actions towards an acceptance of feminism, women's involvement in volunteerism, in the military, activism, documenting war crimes. But what about attitudes for those, over 60? So if any of you would like to comment on that, please.
Well, I can. Yes. I can start, Tamara, and then you can add if you have something else to add. I wouldn't say that there is any specific difference or any specific gap which is observable, or that there is difference in position. First of all, we almost don't have people who experienced the World War II, or they were very, very young because long time has passed. Maybe luckily, there is no double trauma for these people. Some people who are much older and they say like, yeah, I was a very little girl when the Nazis were here and they gave us candies, they didn't bomb our houses. So I read the stories where older women say that it was much that in Nazi times, the Germans were much kinder, and the Russians they just crush it all, and they want to make this land plain. And the thing is that older people are less likely to evacuate for obvious reasons, and they are more vulnerable. They have less opportunities, and they are more reluctant because it's more difficult for them. And I read numerous stories when my peers say, I try to evacuate my parents, they just resist, or it's very difficult. And it's much more, and in case they still do, it's much more difficult for them to adjust to new lives abroad. But they also volunteer a lot, and they do. There is amazing story of the woman, I think it was in Bucha or in one of those towns, who baked bread for the entire week. She said like, that's all I did, and I think it helped her, but she really saved a lot of people with just baking bread for them. So there are also a lot of these amazing stories of women contributing as much as they can, and I think there are much more stories which we still don't know.
Welcome, Marusya. We're glad you could join us. We were just, I was fielding a question, but we can stop so that you can join us. I know that you perhaps are coming in a bit blind, but whatever it is that you would like to contribute, please go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I wrote the time wrong in my calendar. I really apologize. Hello to my fellow panelists. I did prepare a talk. Is it okay to go ahead with it, or? Okay, and can you allow me to share the screen so I can show a film clip?
I believe you're able to go ahead.
Okay, great. All right. And trigger warning, I am going to talk a little bit about rape, but I will not be graphically describing anything. Feminism must be everywhere, writes Sarah Ahmed in her book, Living a Feminist Life. It follows then that feminism must not only be part of how war is done, but also how war is understood. Whether it's Pink Floyd's remake of the patriotic song Czerwona Kalina, or what we see in the news, men are depicted as being at the center of this war. There are no women sharing the frame with President Zelensky. This wartime president seems to operate independently with no opposition. While coming from a feminized, queer-looking theatrical background that includes dancing and the occasional donning of fetish apparel, war has heterosexualized and masculinized, and thus enlarged Zelensky's global image. Where are the women? It's a question I asked during the Revolution of Dignity and continue to ask now as a feminist researcher and filmmaker. In a common trope of 20th century photography now being revived, Ukraine's women are constantly depicted looking out of windows, the window of a train, the window of a bombed apartment building. She has become Berehenya, life-giving mother, mistress of heavenly water, upon which the world relies for fertility. Enraged citizen, she throws pickled tomatoes out a window, destroying a Russian drone. Tireless volunteer, she makes sandwiches and camouflage nets. Thwarted maternal figure, she gives birth in bomb shelters. In 2013, watching the news from Canada, I assumed there were no women on the Maidan. I traveled there in 2014 at the tail end of the Revolution of Dignity, welcomed, in fact, at the entrance to the Zoloty Vorota subway station in Kyiv by Anna Dovgopol, who immediately filled me in on what women have achieved within protest space and connected me with other feminists. I grabbed my camera and managed to make a small film about the women of Maidan, and I'm going to show you an excerpt. It features an interview with Nina Potarska, coordinator of the International Women's League for Peace and Freedom in Ukraine. And in the film, I also tried to depict the class diversity of women involved, from middle-class urban women who traveled to women who traveled from their villages to help however they could. Okay, I'm going to share the screen now, and just give me a minute. Can you see the film? Yes. Okay, great. Full screen.
Ну, сказали, що всім жінкам треба лишити територію Майдану.
І чоловіки просили жінок іти додому, тому що тут небезпечно. Але дуже багато моїх знайомих, жінок, які написали, все, йду в відпустку, беру лікарняний, звільняюсь з роботи. І ми були на Майдані.
Як вже студентів побили, дітей наших, вже ми не змогли б залишити Майдан.
Просто не змогла сидіти вдома.
У них були якісь такі проблеми з тим, щоб включити всіх в протест.
Лікарів не хватало. Я була змушена допомагати людям. Контужен, кому відривало руки, ноги.
Херсонські дівчата, вони рвали свій одяг зубами рвали одяг і перематували людям рани.
Було неможливо дивитися на те все, як наші діти гинули.
Ми намагались прийти до барикади. А нам стоїть такий хлопець, каже, а жінкам сюди не можна. А чому не можна? Можна тільки чоловікам. Я кажу, а ти впевнена, що в тебе рівень фізичної підготовки кращий за мій?
Я вже казала, була б у мене зброя, я б вже пішла зі зброєю.
На барикад багато жінок підтримувало. З палками були, брусчатку кидали, камні кидали, коктейлі кидали.
Але на Майдані зі сцени постійно була така риторика про канапки. Жінки, дякуємо вам за канапки, приходьте там, або в медичну службу максимум. Воїнам дуже потрібна підтримка, їм потрібне тепло. Будь ласка, пригорніть їх там. А я взагалі стою і не можу просто думати, а що це у нас ескорт-сервіс? говорили так, ніби жартома, кажемо, давайте будемо робити жіночу сотню, тому що ну, треба якось об'єднати жінок, щоб показати, що вони є. На малій сцені на Майдані показували кіно, лекції робили, акції робили проти Беркуту. Були і в варті лікарні, це вже на січень була така ініціатива.
Okay, gonna keep going, but I'll cut my talk short because I think the discussion is the most important part. The highly creative contribution of women to Maidan, to the revolution, has been documented in much more detail by my colleagues in Ukraine. But I want to point out the comment on sex work that Potarska makes. It's both hilarious and interesting that she equates the stereotype of revolution and war with prostitution. Sex workers played an important role in both world wars, while also upholding the notion of wartime courage by men being linked with sexual prowess. In the wake of Bucha, we cannot anymore discuss this war without its links to sexuality, gender, and sexual violence. At this moment, and historically, rape becomes the reality of war and also its metaphor. In an address just before the invasion, Putin invoked a Russian rape joke to explain his plans for Ukraine. Conflating Ukraine and Sleeping Beauty, this world leader adopted the point of view of the rapist, quote, "Whether you like it or not, my beauty, you will need to put up with all that I do to you," end quote. And apparently in Russian, this rhymes. Justina Maczyciak writes that, quote, "Apart from achieving strategic goals in a military campaign, the use of sexual violence can bring additional benefits for its perpetrators, like boosting group morale, serving as a prize for underpaid soldiers, the release of sexual and psychological tension," end quote. Sexual violence imposes trauma on a population, making them more compliant, and helps facilitate ethnic cleansing. Dara Cohen, quoted in the same article, describes sexual violence as, quote, "a central technique in the technology of genocide," end quote. It's important also to remember that LGBTQ+ folks experience sexual violence as well, particularly those who are non-binary or trans. Olena Shevchenko, in my 2015 film, This is Gay Propaganda, described how butch lesbians are punished in Ukraine and in Russia via a particular hate crime called corrective rape. These crimes happen and increase wherever there is anti-gay legislation or the threat of it. We must not forget that an anti-gay law has been proposed twice in Ukraine. Homosexuality is still legal there, just before Maidan by Yanukovych and just before the February 2022 invasion by Zelensky himself. As Olena said in my film, normality now for Ukraine means you need to be white, you need to be Ukrainian, you need to be Christian, and of course you need to be heterosexual, because LGBT is now seen as Western influence, imported values, let's say. Olena is now in Lviv, where she has helped to organize, among other things, a shelter for displaced LGBTQ and trans folk, much like the one her organization Insight created 10 years ago in Kyiv. In a recent interview on Democracy Now!, she said, quote, "In terms of war, it's not something women invent, but we are at the center of this war. We heard so many cases of rape in these occupied cities. I hear the sound of women screaming. It's not about heroism or heroes. War is a disaster for everyone and it needs to be stopped. Women are seen as a thing which can be taken. We need more solidarity around the world," end quote. And finally, I just wanted to end with a call for intersectionality and solidarity around our activism and our analysis. We know that we've been living in a time of war for decades: Yemen, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Eritrea, Palestine. We need to revive and update the feminist tradition of global solidarity and coalition work if we have any hope of ending this war. Thank you.
Thank you, Marusya. I am going to now turn over to some questions from our audience, since rather than me continuing, and feel free to unmute yourself.
Ksenia, can I make a short comment?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I was going to invite people.
All of us to be on the same path, and it's really unfortunately, Marusya, that you didn't join us from the beginning, because three of us, we were talking about exactly the same issues that you were trying to represent, giving our Ukrainian visions of this, and I was really very surprised to hear that maybe it's a vision of Western media, because you said that the face of the war is masculine, and what we see, like as President Zelensky becoming the masculine face of the war. So I am really curious that I sense that there is a very big difference in media coverage of the war inside Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, because what you said, that the woman is represented as a refugee, crying, a victim, and so on and so forth. Now I see that it's maybe it's a mostly vision of Western media, because in Ukraine we have exactly the opposite. Now our representation of war is really balanced, and I want to show you an example, and to our audience. I will share my screen for a second. Yes. So as you can see, in this media project, it's about heroes of our fighting, of our front. And here on the front line, you don't see a militarized man. You see a volunteer, an elderly man volunteer, and a young woman volunteer. And of course, you see an army man, and you see an old woman crying, and a guy from fireman. So after Euromaidan, we really changed our media language and our public imagination and the way how we are talking about it. And I hope that you will listen to our presentation, because, for example, Anna Dovgopol made a very good point that now in every speech, we use two forms of wording. We say, thank you to heroes and heroines, thank you to men and women on the front. So actually inside Ukraine, the media coverage is much more emancipated. And now I'm very surprised that Western media that represent emancipated Western world use this stereotypical masculine representation of this war.
Thank you, Tamara. Those are really good points. I am talking about Western media and mainstream Western media, and I have noticed some changes in language. I mean, something I've always said is that from my visits to Ukraine, I've always felt that feminism in Ukraine, that the West has a lot to learn from feminism in Ukraine. And so I know that these changes are also a result of years of feminist organizing. I know there's an LGBTQ+ battalion now in Ukraine, and it will be interesting to see how that changes, whether that impacts, you know, the sort of invisibility of LGBTQ in the face of war. But yeah, thank you for that.
Would any Tamara or Anna want to respond in any way, or should we turn it over to some questions? I know that Miroslava Antonovich is waiting to ask a question live. So Miroslava, please.
Thank you, Ksenia. It's really great to listen to you. I didn't have any question, but what may I ask if I am asked to ask? I just enjoyed listening to great speakers. Women during the war, this is of course a huge issue now for Ukraine. Women are participating in all possible activities. which we, by the way, I don't know if you see me or just hear me. I don't hear you.
We just hear you. That's fine. That's fine.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to imagine now the sphere in which women are not involved in this aggression. I mean, Russian aggression against Ukraine. The question which I am usually asked now these days in different interviews, whether this is genocide, what is going on in Ukraine. And I am 100% sure that this is genocide. And I'm asked whether rape is a separate crime in this genocide, or I mean, whether this is the crime of humanity, or rape is an evidence that the genocide is committed in Ukraine. So evidence which we have now shows that those cases which we know, that rape is now an element of genocide. And this is not new. The Rwandan tribunal, the Yugoslavian tribunal also considered that rape might be a method of genocide. So my question to the speakers, I understand that you are not lawyers, and my question would be a legal one. From your point of view, can we say that rape is a form, a method, a way of genocide, a Russian genocide against the Ukrainian nation? And again, I'm sorry, I'm not especially in the fields which present.
Thank you, Miroslava. Would anyone like to, Tamara, please?
Yeah, I just answered because I participated in some events with human rights defenders, and as I said, for example, I referred on Alexandra Matvichuk and this project Tribunal for Putin, where they collect all cases concerning these atrocities and violence, and actually sexual violence. As far as I know, even internationally now, it's perceived as a form or as a tool and weapon in war. And we have even cases where those people who fight, who work with these issues and fight against sexual violence, they are internationally recognized as for Nobel Prize of Peace, for example. And war in Yugoslavia, actually, it was probably the first event where this mass rape was criticized very publicly, even though the examples of this we have from the Second World War. And it's very important that in Ukraine, these books like Woman in Berlin is translated into Ukrainian in publishing house Komora, and it's possible to read that history repeats. Actually, it's very, from one hand, yeah, it's very sad to hear that we have the similar examples, and it's very important now that all these cases are you know, they are examined, and our ombudswoman office, they work with these cases. Of course, a lot of work is done by NGOs, and usually in Ukraine, and women's NGOs and human rights NGOs, they are those who work with sexual violence in war, and they've been working before also, because there were cases of war in Donbass. But now it's also very important that it's recognized on a general state level, and that it's one of the examples of genocide, as you call it.
Tamara, did you want to jump in? I saw your hand raised.
Mine? No, but
okay.
I also see there are a lot of questions in
Yes,
chat.
yes,
So
I
maybe
will. Yes, I will. So I'll take a simpler one. How are Ukrainian women soldiers and volunteers treated by their Ukrainian male colleagues? Are there reports of sexism? Who would like to tackle that?
I can comment on that because we have Tamara made research together with other colleagues inside the Invisible Battalion project on sexual harassment and sexual violence in army. And it does exist, but the point is that all negative examples of sexism and violence against women in army mostly exist after the war. Like Maria Berlinska, whom Tamara Martsenyuk showed us already, pointed that during the active phase of Euromaidan, she could went to barricades whenever she wanted and no one stopped her. But after the active phase, she was stopped. And the same is with the war in Ukraine since 2014, that during the active phase, women were active fighters and there were no time for sexism, but after that sexism can appear, but we have structures and initiatives to fight it, and we will continue doing that.
There's actually, to address the kind of international aspects of feminism, there's one kind of comment and question of one of our participants signing a letter sponsored by Code Pink, the most important anti-war feminist group in the US. Anti-war work has been part of the feminist movement since the beginning. It is not easy for feminists to support military aid for Ukraine from our countries, meaning out west here, when it means strengthening NATO, which many of us see as an imperialist military machine. So as feminists, how can we support Ukraine against Russia without supporting increased military budgets for our own
Can I
countries?
answer?
Yes,
Can
please
I answer
go
this
ahead.
question? I will
And
do
then
it
Anna
by
also.
joke.
Yeah.
You know, you can do the same that NATO is doing, because NATO now is fighting by Ukrainian hands with Russia and using Ukraine as a shield to Europe and to NATO. So we are used by NATO as a shield to Russia. It's very hypocritical. It's unfair. It's wrong thing to do. But if NATO just, I don't know, ask NATO, give more weapons to Ukraine and have less weapons in NATO state, we will guard your countries for that.
Anna, I think you wanted to join.
Yeah, just to add to what Tamara has said, there is absolutely no way to stop Russia from erasing Ukraine, except for giving a weapon to Ukraine. I'm very sorry to disappoint the pink feminist ideas of peace and love, but there is once again no other way. And as a feminist myself, I hate saying this. I would be very happy to be anti-militarist, and in peaceful time I was also standing against militarization and this military rhetoric, which basically we all know the effects. But when the neighboring country comes and tells you as a nation has no right to exist, and you might want to read the text by Timothy Snyder, who basically interpreted the recent statement issued by Russia, basically their ideological statement that says that Ukraine as a nation should not exist. Ukrainians are Russians. If Ukrainians do not accept the idea that they're Russian, they should be eradicated, full stop. So once again, there is no way to stop Russia except the weapon. And you might have read on the news that the last attempt of Austrian counselor who talked to Putin, his attempt for diplomacy failed, and he is friend with Putin. So I don't know what to add. Maybe you have some better ideas and we'll be happy to learn.
Marusya, please.
So two things. Susan Brown-Miller, who wrote the book Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, argued that having more women in the military would help to prevent, I mean, it's a very idealistic vision, but would help to prevent rape in wartime and would produce more gender equality in peacetime. But I also want to say, and Judy, who wrote this question, is a friend of mine, and we've had some great discussions. But I think that this question sort of also, it makes me think about the problem in the Western left and in Western socialist feminism, which is that the focus is always on the imperialism of the West and not on Russia. And the focus is always, and I'm not saying, Judy, that you're saying that, but this is what I read and hear all the time. The focus is always on, you know, the minority of right-wing supporters in Ukraine. A statistic I often ponder is that more people in Canada voted for a right-wing party than did in Ukraine. I mean, this is a global phenomenon. So I think that it's, you know, one thing that we never had for the past 8 years, or very little of, was solidarity from Western feminism and the Western left. And I think it's really time to, you know, to ask these questions and to speak openly about them, and not to keep insisting on a kind of vague idea of peace as a I mean, I'm a longtime peace activist, but it's no longer possible. That argument is now very limited, and we need to develop a more nuanced conception of feminists' relation to war.
Yes, Tamara, and that you will be our kind of our closing remarks.
Yeah, I
Go
just
ahead.
tried to answer in one answer a couple of questions, and from one hand, you know, I really respect radical feminist position for its criticism. I constantly, doing Project Invisible Battalion, was faced with my colleagues, more radical feminists, for those that were militarized women, even despite the fact that this project was driven by military women who faced the discrimination, and they asked for help to study this and to change the situation. And I respect this position for criticism, but I think it's rather theoretical. I don't see it's very practical right here and right now solution for the situation. And answering the first question from Veronica about anarchist anti-state tendencies, I would say that I want to be grateful to Toronto University for supporting Ukrainian studies, and I do think that in the case when Ukrainian studies in general in the world would be more visible, you would never think that it's a Russian society has more this idea of strong state. In Ukraine for last 8 years, we've been developing a lot, like civil society, a lot of different projects on decentralization. And the fact that now the whole country is volunteering is without any huge centers and coordinations, it's the result of this. And what we need more, and so I don't think that Ukraine would turn to so-called strong state and strong state leader, and vice versa. Here there were also questions about women were active and macho overtone of this war. What I noticed from visuality of this current war, that actually we have less masculinity. Less radical and normative strong masculinities. There are a number of, for example, my Facebook friends, men who are in armed forces or territorial self-defense. They are making pictures with pets, cats, with animals, and it's a bit more, usually, you know, it's a notion of femininity, and they rescue animals, and so I would say even in this war, this recent war after invasion, despite the fact that there are a lot of violence, you don't see such a strong masculinity. And as for why men can't leave country, because it's in legislation and in general in Ukraine, it's obligatory draft for men, and men still can. And there are men, you could see among refugees, men, if they have 3 children and more, or if they have some elderly, of course, some men, they bribe when they leave. And from one hand, it's a problem, I agree absolutely, but it was necessary to have this legislation in a very current situation. But recently what I see, it's more tendency to make more professional armed forces with where women and men and women can join if they feel that it could be their profession. And as a result of public opinion surveys, a couple of years ago, we've been doing this study, and actually majority of population supports this this type of armed forces, not obligatory draft, but professional contract-based army with equal possibilities for men and women to serve.
Thank you, Tamara. And we've gone way over time, so you've been very generous. And I think what you've really brought out is really the humanity of the Ukrainians, whether they are, you know, refugees or fighting or volunteering. I think the love of animals is something that has really brought that out in the media way. Thank you, Tamara Martsenyuk, Tamara Zlobina, Marusya Bociurkiw, and Anna Dovgopol for joining us. And thank you all who have attended.
Thank you very much for having this discussion. I hope that we will repeat and we'll have more conversation like this. Thank you. Thank you for your support.
Have a good evening.